Rahim. So last time we finished Khandaq and we were getting to the part of where the Prophet ﷺ had to deal with Banu Qurayza. I briefly touched on it, but we'll recap on that. In the morning, when the Quraysh had left, they'd gone back. That afternoon, Jibreel ﷺ visits the Prophet ﷺ and tells him, you need to deal with Banu Qurayza. So he's not even given one day to rest. He's immediately told, you need to deal with Banu Qurayza. So the Prophet ﷺ sends 300 soldiers to the fortress where Banu Qurayza was. Do you remember Banu Qurayza? Everyone remember Banu Qurayza? They were the Jewish tribe that was supposed to, had an alliance with the Prophet and was supposed to protect the southern part of it, the defenses. But they betrayed the Prophet ﷺ and allowed the Quraysh to come through there. Now, the Prophet said that to the 300 soldiers, make haste and get to Banu Qurayza. Obviously, because Jibreel ﷺ told him to make haste as well. So he said, make haste, get there, and don't pray Asr until you get there. Right? But there was a delay. As they were getting, it was time to pray Asr. Half the Muslims said, what the Prophet ﷺ meant is to make haste, therefore we're going to pray Asr. The other half said, no, we need to follow the Prophet as he said it, so we will pray when we get there. Later, when they came back to the Prophet ﷺ and told him, he actually turned and said to the group that prayed on time, you are correct. And then he turned to the group that prayed Asr late and he said, you're also correct. Now these 300 soldiers were led by Ali and they besieged the fortress of Banu Qurayza for 25 days. At the end of the 25 days, Banu Qurayza reaches out to their allies, the Aus. They were formerly, Banu Qurayza and the Aus were formerly allies. So they reach out to the Aus and says, what do we do? Abu Lubaba, who was part of the Aus, says, I recommend you surrender. And they said, well, if we surrender, will the Prophet ﷺ show us mercy? And he said, I don't know. And he points to his neck, right? Implying that probably not. You did a pretty bad thing. You betrayed him in the middle of the battle, which could have resulted in the complete annihilation of the Muslims. But suddenly, as soon as Abu Lubaba does this, he feels horrible because it's not his place to say that. And he feels that he had betrayed the Prophet ﷺ. So what he does is he takes a rope and ties himself to a pillar. And he says, I am not going to release myself from this pillar until Allah himself forgives me. Now when the Prophet ﷺ hears this, he says, that is such a shame because if he had come to me, I would have forgiven him. But now that he has made this statement and tied himself to the pillar, there's nothing I can do. This is very interesting because this actually reflects what happened to Banu Qurayza. And we'll see in a few minutes what happens. Now Banu Qurayza is in a bit of a panic, and some of them, named by a person by the name of Amr ibn Suad, actually says, let's convert to Islam, let's become Muslims, or at least give the Prophet ﷺ some tribute and he might be merciful. The Banu Qurayza say, no, we'd rather die. So Amr and some of his family and his followers sneak out in the night, go to the Prophet ﷺ, and they become Muslim. The next day, Banu Qurayza surrenders. The men are separated from the women and children. The women and children are given over to Abdullah ibn Salam to look after. Anyone know who Abdullah ibn Salam? Remember that name? Abdullah ibn Salam? He was the Jewish rabbi from Banu Kainuka who became Muslim. He was a very close companion of the Prophet ﷺ. So because he's Jewish and he's a Jewish rabbi, he is given charge of the Jewish men, the women and children. Now, when the Prophet ﷺ is trying to decide what to do, the Aus, remember the Aus were allies with Banu Qurayza at the time, the Aus sends a delegation to the Prophet ﷺ asking for him to be merciful. And Prophet ﷺ turns to the Aus and says, if I am merciful, will you take responsibility for their decision? Will you decide what's going to happen to them? And they say, yes, we will. So the Prophet ﷺ then calls the people of Banu Qurayza and he says, I can give you two choices. You can let either me make a decision based on the Sharia, based on Islam, or you can allow your friend, the Aus, and the leader of the Aus was Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, the chief of the Aus, Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, to make a decision on you based on your own laws, the Jewish laws. And they say, we want a decision made by Sa'd ibn Mu'adh based on our own laws. And the Prophet ﷺ says, fine, it's out of my hands then. Sa'd ibn Mu'adh does his research and he makes a judgment based on Deuteronomy verses 10 to 15. This is from the Bible, right? And it reads as this. When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. If they accept and open their gates, all the people inside it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. If they refuse to make peace, and they engage you in battle, lay siege to the city. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hands, put to sword all the men in it. As for the women and children, the livestock and everything else in the city, you may take these as plunder for yourself. And you may use the plunder the Lord your God has given from your enemies. This is how you are to treat all the cities that are distant from you, that do not belong to the nations nearby. This is from the Jewish Bible, right? From the Torah, the Talmud. Sa'd ibn Mu'adh does his research and he says, well, your laws say that you have to die. And that's what happens. The fighting men of Banu Qurayza are put to sword. The women and children obviously are not, but the fighting men are. Now this is usually something that people who don't like to talk against Islam use. That the Prophet ﷺ, astaghfirullah, did genocide, killed an entire clan of Jewish clan. This is not true. Firstly, what happened was so severe that it would have been justified actually if that happened. This was high treason in the battle, in the middle of a battle. But secondly, the Prophet ﷺ didn't make the judgment. He didn't make a decision. He actually said, my hands are off this. You've chose the judge, you chose the law, and the decision is now made. Remember how I said that connects with the Sahaba who tied himself to the pillar? So same sort of thing happened. Now, so the question gets, was the entire clan of Qurayza really executed? And I'm going to read from the book. It's a bit long, but I think it's quite important, and they explain it really well. Reports that all adult males of the Qurayza Jews were killed while all their women and children were enslaved are quoted in practically all books on the Prophet's life and its events. However, a more careful examination of these reports proves that this could not have been the case. The number of those who were killed could not have been more than 25, if not less. We find two statements speaking of Sa'd's judgment, but both statements that he ruled that their fighters were to be killed and their offspring to be taken captive. Where Ibn Ishaq's report goes wrong is to interpret this judgment as applying to every single person of the Qurayza Jews, thus making the death sentence applicable to all adult males and the captivity to all women and children. There is nothing either in the Quran or Hadith text to confirm this. The Quran speaks of some being killed and some taken prisoner, while the two Hadith traditions speak of executing the fighters and imprisoning their offspring. Several points Ibn Ishaq's report calls into question. To start with, he mentions that prior to their execution, the men were placed in Usama ibn Zayd's house, while the women were placed in Qasiyah bint Harith's home. How many people could these two homes accommodate? The number of Qurayza men mentioned in these reports range between 600 and 900. What sort of home would take all these people? Al-Wadi was a prominent historian who wrote extensively about the history of Islam. Al-Waqidi gives us the names of 9 people executed as a result of Sa'd ibn Mu'adh's ruling. He also mentions that 2 people were sent to each of the several clans of the Ansar where they were executed. These bring the total number of less than 25. When we relate this information to the most reliable word of Sa'd ibn Mu'adh's ruling, which condemns the Qurayza fighters to be killed, we conclude that there were the actual fighters who took an active part in the treachery that were aimed to eradicate Islam and all Muslims. Ibn Ishaq's account of the life of the Prophet Muhammad was the main source on which later historians relied, as they analyzed events that took place during the Prophet's lifetime. The first reason for rejecting this report is the meting out such collective punishment is contrary to Islamic teaching and to the Prophet's own practice. Islam does not condone punishing a group of people for the crime of one, or punishing many for the crime of the few. It punishes all those who actually take part in the crime. Ibn Ishaq's report suggests that all women and children were taken captive. The question arises, what happened to them after that? In the universal tradition of the time, they have become slaves and given to those who took part in the siege of Qurayza forts. Yet Islam had already established a rule for the prisoners of war, requiring Muslims to set them free, either against a ransom or as a gracious gesture. We have no report to suggest that they stayed in Medina as slaves. There is not a single story on any such woman going through a problem with the family where she might have been placed. The children involved would have been raised as Muslims. We do not have a single report of any of them distinguishing himself in any field of life. Nor do we have any reports of any conversions between the Prophet's companions referring to the punishment of the Qurayza Jews or to the fate of their families. How can this absence of reporting be explained? We note that a similar lack of reporting applies to the other two Jewish tribes that were evacuated from Medina during the Prophet's lifetime, the Kainuka and Al-Nadir. This suggests that the Prophet's companions and the early Muslim historians did not concern themselves with the tracing fate of those evacuated Jews after they had left Medina. The same must have been applied to the Qurayza Jews. We therefore conclude that the execution of the perpetrators of the treachery and the rest of the tribe were allowed to leave Medina on similar terms to other Jewish tribes which were previously evacuated. Does that make sense? So the whole situation is really blown out. If you look at it very historically and from a very academic point of view, it was only the men who took part in the treachery itself, most likely, that were executed. Not only that, they were executed not on the Prophet ﷺ's orders or judgment, but on the decision made by Sa'd ibn Mu'adh, which was agreed to by the people of Banu Qurayza. So it's really not what it's made out to be in this situation. Now, shortly after the judgment, Sa'd ibn Mu'adh actually passes away, and the Prophet ﷺ buries him with his own hands. Meanwhile, Abu Lubaba, who's been now tied to the pillar for 2 weeks, he's still in the pillar for 2 weeks, when Surah Al-Tawbah is revealed, verses 102 to 104. When this surah is revealed, the Prophet ﷺ goes to Abu Lubaba himself and tells him the good news and unties him. Abu Lubaba is so happy that he gives 1/3 of his wealth in charity. And if you note that the last portion of Surah Tawbah actually talks about giving in charity. So based on that, Abu Lubaba gives 1/3 of his wealth in charity. Now, we're now 5 months after Khandaq. 5 months after Khandaq, the Prophet ﷺ sends Zayd ibn Harith on an expedition to intercept the Quraysh caravan belonging to Safwan ibn Umayyah. The Meccans in this caravan is taken hostage. So they capture the caravan and the Meccans are taken hostage. Among the hostages is Abu Alas ibn Arabiya. Anyone know who this is? Abu Alas ibn Arabiya. It's not a famous name, but a very close person to the Prophet ﷺ. Zainab's husband. Zainab's husband, so the Prophet ﷺ's son-in-law, who fought the Muslims at the Battle of Badr. Now, he was taken captive. And he was released on the condition that Zainab, who was still held by her in-laws in Mecca, is given back to the Prophet ﷺ along with Umama. So there was an exchange. And Zainab, who's obviously Muslim, came back to her father, and her husband, who was not a Muslim at this time, was released back to his family. Now this same person is captured again. He manages to escape his captors in the night and goes to his wife's house and asks his wife to protect him. The next day in the morning, Zainab comes to the mosque where there is Jummah prayer, and after Jummah prayer, she gets up in front of everyone and surprises everyone by saying that she is declaring refuge for her husband, saying that I am protecting my husband. Remember when we started the Seerah, I said that through the Seerah we're going to see very strong women. We're going to continuously see women who are very strong, very outspoken, and very brave. Zainab in this instance did a very brave thing. He said, I am protecting my husband and I give him sanctuary. The Prophet ﷺ accepts this and he says, fine, you can give him sanctuary, no harm will come to him, but he is not your husband. He's not a Muslim, he is a polytheist, we cannot accept the marriage. So the marriage is nulled. But Zainab again asks on behalf of her now former husband that the Prophet ﷺ give back his wealth which was captured. And again the Prophet ﷺ agrees. So the Prophet ﷺ gives back Abu Alas's wealth and lets him leave. Abu Alas leaves with his wealth, goes and continues his trading, finishes the trading, but instead of going back to Mecca, he comes back to Medina and accepts Islam. So that's a little bit of an interesting side story that happens there. Now, when the Quraysh hear that Safwan's caravan has been captured, they are desperate. Remember, they went from being right at the top, now they're almost right at the bottom. Their northern trade route is blocked. They can't go there because Medina's up in the north. The southern trade route to Yemen is also blocked because of the alliances that the Prophet ﷺ has with the southern tribes. Quraysh are desperate, they're running out of money, and for the Quraysh to run out of money, that is a big problem because they are a trading people. That is what they live off. So they decide to open a new trade route, and the only one they can use is the western one that goes along the Red Sea coast. They go to the biggest tribe in that area, the Mustalaq tribe, and they make an alliance. And they tell them to keep that trading route open for them because that is the only way they can trade now. Mustalaq agrees and also says that they will plan to attack Medina. The Prophet again hears of this news, and before Mustalaq can attack Medina, he sends a force out to attack Mustalaq. But there's not a battle. Soon as the people of Mustalaq sees the strength of the Muslims, they surrender. And they're all taken captive. Again, a very famous strong woman, Juwaira bint Harith. She is the daughter of the chief of the Mustalaq tribe. She secretly, without telling anyone, leaves the tribe and goes to the Prophet ﷺ herself and goes to him and says, I am part of the captives, but I don't have the wealth to release myself as a hostage. I don't have any money. Can you pay my ransom? It's a very interesting situation. She's asking the Prophet who captured them to pay the ransom for her. And the Prophet says, yes, I will pay your ransom out of my own money, but would you be willing to marry me? And Juwaira is overjoyed. She says, yes, of course I will marry you. So Juwaira bint Harith marries the Prophet ﷺ. Her father, not knowing what has happened, comes to the Prophet ﷺ and says, I've brought the ransom for my daughter to release her. So I've got this many camels that I brought to release her. And the Prophet ﷺ says, you've brought your camels, but you didn't bring your two best camels. Your two best camels you hid. Isn't your daughter worth the two best camels? And this shocks him. He said, how do you know that I hid my two best camels? And that changes his mind and he accepts Islam. When the chief and the chief's daughter has accepted Islam, most of the people of Mustalaq accept Islam. And when the Muslims hear what has happened, a lot of the people that were captured from Khandaq were from the Mustalaq tribe. They were a big tribe that had allied with the Quraysh. So there was a lot of captives. When the Muslims hear, all those captives are released without any ransom. So suddenly the Quraysh not only was not able to set up a western trading route, even that potential trading route is now gone forever because the Mustalaq tribe is now Muslims and have allied with the Prophet ﷺ. The Quraysh are desperate. They don't know what to do anymore. Aisha later talks about Juwaira like this. I know of no woman who has done a greater blessing to her people than Juwaira. So when we talk about the wives of the Prophet,
how many wives the Prophet has got at that time?
We'll cover that in a little while. We're not going to focus on that yet, but we'll get to that. When we talk about a lot of the wives of the Prophet, we hear about Khadija and Hafsa and Aisha, but we forget some of these people, like Juwaira. She was a strong woman, and she saved the entire tribe and brought them to Islam with her strength, and Aisha respected her a lot for that. Now, about the marriages of the Prophet ﷺ. I'll read again from the book. It goes like this. Though there is no reason to suppose that he disregarded the factor of physical attraction, it is practically certain that he had his feelings towards the fair sex well under control. When we say he, we're talking about the Prophet ﷺ, and that he did not enter into marriage except when they were politically and socially desirable. It is possible too to go further and while restricting oneself to the standpoint of Prophet ﷺ's time, to turn the alleged instances of treachery and sensuality into a matter of praise. In his day and generation, the Prophet ﷺ was a social reformer, indeed a reformer even in the spheres of morals. He created a new system of social security and a new family structure, both of which were a vast improvement on what went before. In this way, he adapted for settled communities all that was best in the morality of the nomad and established a religious and social framework for the life of a sixth of the human race today. This is not the work of a traitor or legend. So what it's saying is that the Prophet ﷺ actually changed the social structure. But in a lot of the marriages, there was also a political reason. There was also a humanitarian beneficial reason in his marriages, except for Khadija. That was different. That was purely out of love. And he loved the other wives as well, obviously. But there were reasons as a head of state. This is very common. You look at any head of state.
Yeah, but was that the ayah about the mathna wa thulatha wa ruba' was revealed that
No, we covered that last week. That was the one we covered last week. Now, but there's another opinion on trying to rationalize his marriages, and we'll cover this. I'll read this now. It is tempting to explain most of the Prophet's marriages in terms of political, social, or religious aims, which attended each one of them. One must be careful, however, of oversimplifying matters, seeking justifications for things which one should accept without too much worry. The Prophet was allowed by God to marry as many women as he wished. If he therefore availed himself of this permission for no reason other than that for which people normally get married, this should be an absolutely satisfactory explanation. The fact that he made use of this concession in order to achieve a beneficial result for Islam and for the Muslim community increases one's love and respect for him. One need not unduly bother with what he did in this connection. Sufficient is the fact that this permission was given to him by God and that he, God's messenger, could just judge best when to use this concession. So what the writer is saying is that as Muslims, we accept that the Prophet ﷺ is the Prophet ﷺ and that Allah gave him this special ability to marry as many as he wanted. And we Muslims don't have that. We're limited. But for him, he was allowed to. Now, he could have then married for whatever reason he wanted. The condition that he could marry as many as he wanted was not based on you have to do it for this reason or that reason. He was allowed. But because of his character, because of who he was, he married, and in his marriages he ensured there was a benefit for the Ummah. There was a benefit for Medina. There was a political reason that protected people. There was strategic. Even in his marriages he thought about his followers. Even in this most personal of things, he thought about his Muslim Ummah. And that in itself should give us a lot of love. Now, on the trip back from Mustalaqs, a lot of key incidents happen. A lot of important things start to happen. One of them was Abdullah ibn Ubay has a fight with Omar. Remember Abdullah ibn Ubay? Who's Abdullah ibn Ubay? His name pops up a lot. Anyone know? Abdullah ibn Ubay? He was... No, the hypocrite. The person who was going to be crowned the king of Medina before the Prophet ﷺ came. He has a fight with Omar on the way back. And he says, these muhajirun think they're better than us while they live in our land and order us around. When we return to Medina, we're going to drive them out. Right? So he starts saying this after fighting with Omar. A Khazraj by the name of Zayd ibn Akram. I say a Khazraj because a Khazraj means that he was not a muhajirun. He was from Medina. Hears this and goes and tells the Prophet ﷺ what Abdullah ibn Ubay says. Omar also comes and tells the Prophet ﷺ what Abdullah ibn Ubay says and tells the Prophet, we should execute him. We should kill him. And the Prophet says, why, O Omar? If we execute him, will not the people say that Muhammad kills his own followers? And so the Prophet says, no, I'm not going to execute him. So he calls Abdullah ibn Ubay and says, did you say this? And Abdullah says, no, I didn't say that. I never said that. When he says, I never said that, the Prophet ﷺ says, well, there's no evidence. One person says he said, he says he doesn't. This is hearsay. Look, forget this. The matter is finished. Everyone leave. Soon after, Surah Al-Munafiqun is revealed. Surah Al-Munafiqun, verses 8 is revealed. Right? I'm not going to read that, but it's about pretty much pointing to Abdullah ibn Ubay and saying he's a munafiq. He did say that, and what Zayd said was correct. When Abdullah's son Abdullah hears this, he comes to the Prophet ﷺ and says, there's nothing more we can discuss. The revelation has come. It's very clear that it's about my father. Give me permission to execute my father. When he says this, the Sahaba are shocked. He's like, how can you ask permission to execute your own father? And Abdullah says, because I love my father, and if someone else executes him, I will have so much anger towards that person that I would want to harm him. And that's not right. But if I execute him, then no, I can't harm anyone. Does this give you an idea of the principles of the Sahaba at the time and their moral compass? It was so strong. The Prophet ﷺ says this. He says, no, let us deal gently with him and make the best of his companionship as long as he's with us. This is even after the revelations come and said he's a munafiq. The Prophet says, he's old, he's with us, let's make the best, let's take the good from what we have until we have him. I mean, it is, if you know the Prophet and you know the Seerah, it is impossible really to say the things that some people say about the Prophet. That he was always fighting, that he killed his enemies, that whenever he could, he tried his level best to show mercy. Including Abdullah ibn Ubay, who caused a lot of problems for him, and revelation itself comes down and points to him. The Prophet still tries, whenever he can, to find some mercy. Now, when this revelation comes, though, another thing happens. A lot of the Muslims start getting worried, and they start asking, am I a hypocrite? Do I have hypocritical feelings? And they come to the Prophet ﷺ and they ask these questions. Now, I'll read again from the text. It says, the Quran's examination of the hypocrites led many companions to reflect on their own level of sincerity. On one occasion, a well-meaning Sahaba approaches the Prophet, fearing that he might be harboring elements of hypocrisy. He explains that his faith is strong when he's with the Prophet, yet weakens when he goes about by his daily business. After listening to his concerns, the Prophet gently reassures him that his pattern of behavior is not a sign of hypocrisy, but of his humanity. By its very nature, he explains, spirituality is in a constant state of flux. We get a very important lesson from this revelation and also from the little fight that Abdullah had with Omar. And that very important lesson is, anyone? What's the very important lesson we got from that? That if your faith goes up and down, don't be too hard on yourself. It happens because you're human. It doesn't happen because you're a hypocrite. And the Prophet said, this is a natural state. When you're with me, your faith will go up. It's the same for us. We come to the mosque, we hang out with the brothers and the sisters, our faith is up. You go home and you do the dishes and you deal with the kids and your faith will drop. This was a real problem for the Sahaba. They thought they were hypocrites. And the Prophet said, no, it is normal. It is a state of being a human. Now, there's also another very important thing that happens on the way from Mustalaq. On the way returning from Mustalaq, Aisha had a necklace that her mother gave as a wedding present. She realizes she's lost the necklace. So she's panicking and tells the Prophet ﷺ, and she gets off the camel and they have to stop the entire army. So the entire army now has to stop. And she's now looking around for the necklace. Abu Bakr gets very angry with her. He says, what are you doing? The time for prayer is coming. We need to get wudu, and we haven't reached the oasis yet. This is what interesting. This is why when I was doing this, I found this very interesting. For us, doing wudu was a very simple matter. You go to the bathroom and you do wudu, right? But for the Muslims at that time, they had to have a logistical plan because they didn't have enough water. So to pray 5 times a day was a lot harder than for us. They had to literally plan ahead to where they're going to get to the next oasis. So we're here and it takes this many hours to get to this oasis, so we have to be traveling at this distance just so we can get wudu and just so we can pray in time. You see why the Sahaba were so great? The challenges we have were multiplied 100-fold for them. Anyways, Abu Bakr gets very angry and says, we're not at the oasis, you've stopped the entire army just for your necklace, we're going to miss our prayer and we can't do wudu. And that's when the revelation comes about. Anyone? Tayammum. That's when we get the permission to do tayammum in situations where there's not enough water and you can't use the sand. And a lot of the Sahaba are so overjoyed because this is a real problem for them. When they go trading, when they go back, this was a real big stress. They're so happy that Aisha lost the necklace. It's like, thank God to that we got this permission to do tayammum. Anyway, Aisha finds the necklace. It was under the camel all the time. And the camel gets up, she finds the necklace. It's interesting, and I think that's a miracle in itself. That, she lost the necklace and then she made the camel sit, but it was under the camel. So maybe it was just a lesson for us to learn about tayammum. Anyway, they get up and they kept going. The army moves on, and guess what happens? Anyone guess what happens? No, not yet. Aisha loses the necklace again, second time. She can't find the necklace again, but this time she's too embarrassed to tell the Prophet ﷺ and to stop the whole army. So she gets off by herself when the army stops to rest and goes off looking for the necklace herself. When she returns, the army has moved on. There's no one there. They've left Aisha. And she's now not knowing what to do, so she sits down at the campsite where the soldiers were and hopes that they remember they've left her and comes back for her. She's waiting there, but what happens is a Sahaba by the name of Safwan ibn Muattai comes towards her. He had been lagging behind from the army. He was behind, and so he reaches the campsite and sees Aisha and tells Aisha, come with me, I'll take you to Medina, you can ride on my camel. So they ride to Medina, and as they're entering Medina, people see Aisha with Safwan on his camel, and you can imagine what happens. Gossip starts to spread that Aisha has been up to no good with this Sahaba. The Prophet ﷺ is greatly troubled about this and asks advice from his family. He doesn't believe it, but he doesn't know what to do. Usama and Ayman. Who's Ayman? Another name for Ayman? Anyone know another name for Ayman? Famous Sahabi that I like very much. The Prophet ﷺ loved her a lot. Barakah, the maid who looked after the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ thought of her as her own mother. And when, remember, someone insulted Bilal about being black, he said, I am the son of a white woman and the son of a black woman, son of a white woman referring to Amina and son of a black woman referring to Barakah. So her name now is Ayman. They say, no, we know Aisha. Aisha would never do something like this. And they come to her defense. The Prophet ﷺ asks Ali. Ali gives a more rational, very logical response. He's like, Aisha would not have done this, but if you have doubt, go talk to the person who knows the most, her handmaid, because her handmaiden was there since she was a child. Go ask her if this is in the nature of Aisha, if there's anything bad about Aisha. So the Prophet ﷺ talks to the handmaid, and the handmaid says, in all the time I have known Aisha, I can only think of one bad thing she's ever done in her life, ever. Which is when she was a child, she was given the responsibility to look after the dough, the kneaded dough to make bread. She fell asleep and the goats ate it. And she got scolded by her parents for that. That is the only thing I can think of. So this is not in Aisha's nature to do anything of this sort. But the problem is the Prophet ﷺ believing it and Aisha's family believing it and the Ahlul Bayt believing it doesn't matter. Because the rumor is now spread so far and wide that all of Medina is talking about it. So Prophet ﷺ then decides to put an end to this. He goes to the mosque the next day and climbs to the pulpit and says, I believe in Aisha. She has not done anything wrong. The problem happens is that the Aus gets up and says, yeah, we believe in Aisha as well. It's the Khazraj. They're the ones spreading the rumors. The Khazraj get up and say, that's a lie. It's the Aus who's spreading the rumor. They're the ones who did that. And then they start fighting. So now the Prophet ﷺ not only has to deal with the rumor, he has to deal with these two tribes fighting each other. So he immediately disperses everyone and says, go away. This is becoming a real stress for him. Fitna. Yeah. It is fitna, and it's funny, fitna gives birth to fitna. The rumor has now given birth to infighting. And this happens. This happens amongst Ummah. And we'll get to that. One of the greatest fears the Prophet ﷺ had for his Ummah was, anyone know? Anyone know what he said? The greatest fear. He said, I do not fear you going back to idolatry. That will never happen, ever, till the day of judgment, as a whole. But I do fear one thing for you. You know what he said? Tribalism, infighting, creating little sects and clans, and I don't like this person, and I don't like that mosque, and I don't like these people. He said, I fear that most because that is what will destroy the Ummah. It has happened. Now, so this is a real problem. Aisha was distraught. The Prophet ﷺ goes to Aisha and says, I believe you, but Aisha says, it doesn't matter if you believe. It doesn't matter if all these people believe me. My name has gone. I need Allah to reveal something, a vision, a dream, something. Allah has to save my reputation. Suddenly, the Prophet ﷺ gets Surah An-Nur, verses 11 to 17 is revealed. And it's like this. I will read this verse. Those who brought out the slanderous charges against the Prophet's wife Aisha are nothing more than a gang among you who tried to stir up trouble. Don't think of it as a bad thing, however, for it was ultimately a good thing for you that this issue was dealt with openly. Every man among them will have his sin recorded, and the one who was the most involved among them will have a terrible punishment. When you first heard of the situation, why didn't the men and women of faith think better to themselves and say, this is obviously a false charge? Why didn't they bring 4 witnesses to prove it? When they failed to bring witnesses, they were proven to be liars in the sight of God. If it wasn't for Allah's favor towards all of you and His mercy, both in this world and in the next, then a terrible punishment would certainly have fallen on you on the account of your indulgence in this affair. While you were eagerly passing these lies with your tongues and saying with your mouth things you knew nothing about, you thought it was just a trivial matter. But in Allah's sight, it was a serious issue. When you first heard about it, why didn't you say it's not right for us to talk about this? Glory to your Lord, this is an awful rumor. Allah is warning you sincerely not to repeat this, that if you are a sincere believer, that is a very strong verse. Very, very strong verse. It is pretty much, and it's not even saying you did bad, it's pretty much saying, why didn't you do this? And why didn't you do this? You had these options, and you thought this was such a small thing. It wasn't. It was very heavy, and if it wasn't for my mercy, you would be in big, big trouble. Now, this was a very big stress for Aisha, and it was a very big stress for the Prophet ﷺ. But there is also a great lesson in this, and Sheikh Hamza Yusuf talks about it, and I'll end it here. He says this: this is the wisdom of understanding that tribulation is a hikmah, a wisdom for the believer. Don't think that tribulations are a bad thing. The tribulations can be a good thing. Look how much you learn. Look how much Aisha learns. She had to have this experience because Allah wanted great things for Aisha. And one of them is that she comes to know Allah absolutely and completely. So don't think these things, bad things that happen to you, are evil. They're not bad things. They are good things because you are a believer. In these verses, not only is Aisha exonerated from the rumors, not only is the infighting stopped, not only are the people told not to lie, but Aisha's status is brought to such a high standard that thereafter, even after Prophet ﷺ passed away, many of the great Sahaba referred to her as one of the most prominent scholars. She had so much respect amongst the community. But this had to happen for that to happen. And if that didn't happen, we know that Aisha is one of the greatest muhaddiths and greatest sources of hadith. Would we have had that hadith if this didn't happen? Would the ummah have saved those hadiths? Would the respect for her allowed those hadiths to be saved if this didn't happen?
She became more accountable.
And because of that, it really shaped our idea of our deen. Because, as you know, we take the Quran and the hadith. A lot of those hadiths was from Aisha. So this incident was such a small thing, but it had such a great impact to us, to this day, to this very day. And it's also a lesson, of course, to remember that trials are not the be-all and end-all. It will have a flow-on effect. And for a believer, every trial is good. And we will stop there. I hope you enjoyed the seerah. Inshallah, we will start again after Eid. We'll be taking a break during Ramadan. So in advance, happy Ramadan and Eid Mubarak to everyone. And we'll see you again after Eid. Assalamu alaikum.